Welcome to a special edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Tom Ricks. Those of you who know the show know that Grace Under Pressure poses questions to thought leaders and doers like Tom, who are helping us navigate our world that is upside down right now. Grace Under Pressure talks about the issues that are too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the connecting, the compassion we feel. And grace to me is generosity we show, the commitment to others, and also how leaders are navigating, how they keep it together. And our guest today, Tom Ricks. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Tom is the author of 8 books, and his newest is First Principles. I'll get to that in just a moment. Tom is formerly a reporter with the Washington Post, and then on the staff of the Wall Street Journal, where I first came across his work. You have done lots of military reporting from places like Somalia, Haiti, Korea, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And you're a member of two Pulitzer Prize winning teams. And you have written a number of books, and I think I have these, The General, Churchill and Orwell, and First Principles now. First Principles, which is the book we're going to talk about today, Tom wrote when you were a visiting fellow of professor at history at Baldoni College in Maine, where Tom is there now. And General James Mattis himself, the owner of 7,000 books, or used to be, had said, Ricks knocks it out of the park with this jewel of a book. On every page, I learn something new. Read it every night if you want to restore your faith in the country. Wow, what a endorsement from someone like the General. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Great. Tom, our show focuses on what leaders can do to keep it together in times of crisis. Your newest book is First Principles, which focuses on the critical forces that shaped the education of our founding fathers. What drew you to our founders?
It really started the morning after the last election, presidential election, 4 years ago. And I woke up that morning and I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo myself here. It's kind of hard to speak. Maybe I'll take off the mic a little bit.
Yeah.
Take off the headphones.
Sorry. Technology's grand, isn't it? When it works?
So anyways, 4 years ago, presidential election, I wake up the next morning and I say, what just happened here? I don't understand what's going on in this country. I don't understand what a lot of people seem to think this country's about. And that began for me a long journey reading. I started with the fundamentals. I went back and took down my old copy of Aristotle's Politics and reread it in the context of the election of Trump. I was struck that at one point Aristotle says that oligarchy, ruled by the rich, is a very unstable form of government. And that led me to other readings, led me to other ancient Roman and Greek history, and that eventually led me to the revolutionary generation of America, because they were so influenced in how they thought about politics, how they thought about forming the country by ancient history, especially Roman political history.
That's great. It is said that history it often reflects the time in which the history book reflects the time in which it is written. So I think you're answering that too. So what lessons does First Principles have for us right now?
I think there's a lot we can take away from the history of the founding of the country, the designing of the country. One thing that's really striking to me is how resilient Constitution turned out to be, that 275, 250 years later, it still works, more or less. It has problems. But remember, it was designed to be changed. That's why they call them amendments. I think the second thing is it's really striking how the founders dropped the ball on slavery. They were terrified of the country falling apart over the issue of slavery, so they wove it into the Constitution. As a friend of mine said, slavery is not a stain on the American fabric, it is part of the American fabric. We're still pulling out those strands, those yards There are still Americans who don't believe that black people are first-class American citizens. Unfortunately, some of those people are wearing police uniforms. I think the third thing that resonates with today, that would strike the founders, is the involvement of money in politics. This was clearly not what they were thinking of. They would call it corruption, pure and simple. To have the dollar outweigh the vote, to have rich people controlling politics. As Bernie Sanders, I'm not a fan of Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders, I think, is right when he says that Congress doesn't regulate Wall Street. Wall Street regulates Congress. And they would say, people are in danger of losing the democracy we gave you. You are drifting toward oligarchy.
Well, the quote from Ben Franklin has become reinvigorated when his quip about a republic, if you can keep it. And certainly we aren't.
Striking. George Washington, in his first inaugural, refers to America as an experiment. And I was struck the other day, Barack Obama referred to America as a multicultural, multi-ethnic experiment. And we could still lose this experiment if we're not careful.
Right. I do a lot of teaching, and you may remember the movie Gettysburg, and there's a famous speech where Jeff Daniels playing your fellow Tom is joining us from Maine, where he owns a place, and Joshua Chamberlain gives this speech before the Battle of Gettysburg.
Later president of Bowdoin College.
Yes, exactly. And he talked about, it's adapted from Killer Angels, the novel, but he talks about this country was not founded on land or blood or soil or whatever. It was founded on an ideal, and that comes again and again and again. And so that also the part, Tom, experiment means we're still learning, which is my field. But sometimes I think, haven't we learned this enough?
Sometimes I think every generation has to relearn it.
Right. Something that's in your book, First Principles, which I liked. I'm an Anglophile. I lived in the United Kingdom for a while, and a big Churchill fan, as you are. I was surprised. You said the founders were shaped by the Scottish Enlightenment. Shame on me, I didn't know much about the Scottish Enlightenment. So tell us what that meant for the country.
I think this is actually a major mistake in the teaching of American history. And it goes back to a guy named Carl Decker, who wrote early in the 20th century that John Locke was central to the writing of the Constitution. Well, the nice thing is, these days we have this thing called Founders Online. Every word ever uttered by all the founders, everything they wrote in letters, diaries, their speeches, their pamphlets. And I can sit down and tell you how many times they refer to John Locke and how many times they refer to other people. Well, they refer to Montesquieu, French philosopher, inventor of the modern democratic state. They refer to them twice as much as they refer to John Locke. John Locke had some but I actually think the Scottish Enlightenment and Montesquieu, who himself is probably the most important philosopher affecting the Scottish Enlightenment, are much more important than John Locke, English Enlightenment.
Right. Tell us, where we're talking about the Enlightenment, tell us about what, in the world in which I work on organizational culture and leadership, we talk a lot about values. Are values the same as virtue? What did the founders mean by virtue?
Virtue is a key word for them. In fact, to go back to Founders Online, they use it twice as often as they use freedom or liberty. But it doesn't mean to them what it means to us. There's a saying, the path is in the country, and it really is. And even although they use the same words, it's a different language. Virtue to them meant a public mind, in an especially stoic Roman. The model for George Washington and other people was Cato. Roman political figure, frugal, prudent, wise, just, and reserved. And Washington, who had a volcanic temper, who could explode a couple of times on the battlefield, absolutely lost his shit. Spent his life learning to control himself. learning to learn from experience, and to be more like
Right. It brings us to the four founders you speak about are Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. So let's take Washington quickly. You tell us about Washington. He was a man whose deeds outmatched his words. And something I didn't really know until I had read your book, that he had something of an inferiority complex about his education.
as well he might. He was the only one of the first four presidents not to go to college. He never learned to speak a foreign language. He never read Greek and Latin, as the others did. He never traveled. He traveled only once out of the country. He goes to the West Indies, where his most notable achievement was getting smallpox. At one point, John Adams and another member of the cabinet, Thomas Pickering, had an argument on whether Washington actually was illiterate. And Pickering said, yes, he is. Adams said, no, he wasn't. He wrote great letters to me when I was in the Congress during the war. Pickering said, no, that Alexander Hamilton kid wrote those, not Washington.
Yeah.
Washington, though, like a lot of intelligent people who are not well educated, taught himself to learn from experience. He observed, he reflected, and he changed in response to those reflections. Arguably better than his three peers did that I write about. He was a very nautical man. He was a man of deeds, not words.
Yes.
That's also soldierly.
And that's what you point out. And while he's often criticized for his generalship, if you will, he grew and learned as the war went on. And he had this master view, if I'm interpreting, he had a way of connecting to people. And it wasn't easy for him as this, call it aristocrat coming from Virginia, to take over a semblance of an army of New Englanders who really didn't have much respect for him, and vice versa. So,
well, he thought they were kind of dirty, maybe disrespectful. They didn't show him any deference. They didn't look like regular soldiers, and indeed they weren't. They were farmers who had volunteered. Now, Washington's great achievement here is learning to understand his instrument. They were not hammers, they were saws. And you don't criticize the saw for not being a hammer. You learn to use the saw. Well, in the same way, he learned to use the materials he had. And he realized the militia is going to be lousy in force-on-force battles.
Right.
When the British regulars come down with bayonets, they're going to run.
yeah.
But if you let them protect their farms, fight in the fields and woods around areas where they grew up, you let them skirmish with the British, attack them when they're out looking for food, that will work. It's important because battles don't happen very often. The soldiers have to eat every day.
Right.
And he whittles away the British. And he's very successful in that, a war without battles.
Right. The other character is John Adams, who, from I've heard you speak, is not one of your favorites, and maybe not one of the favorites of the founders either, because he was something of an had a temper and was sort of full of himself. So, what lessons can we learn from Adams?
Adams wanted to be an American Cicero, and the amazing thing is he achieved that. This is to be a key political figure in his time. And he does it without any real advantage. He gets himself to Harvard, but his parents have no money. He gets out of Harvard and goes becomes a school teacher. He rises up. The two things we have to credit him for, he gets the ball of revolution running very early on, before war begins. His other great achievement is he's the first president to lose a re-election.
Yeah.
And he's a one-term president. He's quite bitter about it. But he turns over power peacefully to the opposition.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, and I think you had mentioned, is something about his other great achievement is he married Abigail.
Yes. Abigail Adams, a wonderful woman, brilliant. And I think one reason that John Adams went as far as he did was he listened to Abigail, who was as smart as him, much more sensible.
Yeah, and that's such a, I mean, in that way, very much a modern man, because he, certainly listening to his wife on matters of state or whatever makes him not the same of his time. So switching gears to someone Thomas Jefferson, whom I actually, like you in a way, have lost respect for over the years. So he. I'm sorry. So you tell me about Jefferson. So.
You got to have respect for Jefferson, if only for the Declaration of Independence, our single greatest shining document that has made the aspiration for our country foremost. All men are created equal, everyone deserves equal justice for the law. That's key. And his first inaugural address is important. Aside from that, though, what drives me batty about Jefferson is the gap between his words and his actions.
Yeah.
He is a big old critic. He spends his life writing about liberty while he's being waited on by people who are his property.
Yeah.
And he never deals with that gap. It's part, he may be difficult with this because he is not a Stoic, he's not a Roman. Of all the people we're talking about, he's the most Greek, very influenced by the pursuit of happiness, the avoidance of pain.
Right. Interesting, because you write too about the pursuit of happiness, which is a top of mind issue for all of us now. So what did the founders mean by happiness?
They most certainly did not mean sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Which is kind of the American concept. For them, it was leading a prudent, wise, just, decent life, and doing the common good. And so it doesn't sound as selfish when we talk about pursuit of happiness as it may seem to us now. But the common good was very important. General wealth, twice, the Constitution. I wish we would pay more attention.
I'm related on the common good too, because was it not Washington who talked about the public good, or was it about values and trusting people? But then after his first term, he said, wait a minute, I think we need to have laws around this or rules. Was it not? Did I get that right? So.
Not exactly, but because the basic idea is he goes as an adult, he's looking for people who can work with the common good. Increasingly in the war, he comes to realize that's not going to happen. And James Madison comes along and says, that's right. We need a constitution that balances people's selfishness. Madison famously said, if men were angels, we'd be government. And so Madison designing a constitution that enables everybody to balance different interests. And he disperses power, because it's so important. Provides power of state, federal government, with the notion that if you can't make deals, cut compromises, alliances, you're not going to make any.
Right.
So Madison argued, hey, good luck. I wrote that bug. That's a church.
Great. Can I adjust your sound just a little bit, because it was dropping out a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. I want to get to Madison now, because you seem to have a particular fondness for him in there. He was he was a Virginian of the aristocratic class, the only one to, quote, go north for school. He went to Princeton. So,
Little Jimmy Madison, you're right. I do have a fondness for him because I think he's underappreciated. I'm amazed as far as he did with some of the liabilities he had. He was a small man. 5'1", maybe 110 pounds. He suffered from some form of epilepsy. We're not quite sure why. He did not have a good voice. He wasn't very social. This is not a model for a great politician. Yet through willpower, through rigorous study, he makes himself the single most important person in the country in forming the Constitution and getting the Constitution ratified, and then in the 1790s, developing the beginnings of American political parties. So I would say, if George Washington wanted the country with the Revolution, James Madison designed the country.
And Madison, of all these four that you talk about, was the most shaped by the Scottish Enlightenment because he had a tutor who was a Scot. Am I correct in that? So,
A tutor who was a Scot, as did Jefferson. The difference is right. Yes, Madison goes off to Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey, unusually led by Scottish clergy. John Weatherspoon, himself very good. At a time when you did see a lot of ministers, politics, John Weatherspoon is very involved. He's at the Constitution, he's at the Declaration of Independence, signed that he is part of the ratification of the Constitution. And you can go back and read his lectures. I love this. There are notes from lectures he gave, in which he's talking about checks and balances. And Madison clearly did those.
right. That and there's a quote you have in there from Montesquieu, which you posted online, and I referenced it. That almost could, aside from the abolition of slavery, could have been written right into the Declaration of Independence. So,
Yeah. Montesquieu is this astonishing because Montesquieu is this great bridge between the ancient world, the Scottish Enlightenment, and America. Montesquieu writes a whole book on the Roman Republic, and then his masterpiece, Spirit of Laws, a good third of this is what we can take away from it. The funny thing is, he came to two conclusions that really were problems for the founders. The republics had to be small, like city-states, and they weren't very sustainable. And so a lot of the Constitution is an attempt to address those two problems.
and we're still wrestling with it right now. Well, and of course we had the Civil War, which
remember, these guys wrote it to be amended, and I think we've kind of fallen down on that. There were a lot of amendments to the Constitution in the first century, but in the last 50 years, there's hardly anything. Remember, these guys made this up on hot summer afternoons in Philadelphia, and then they went out for beers.
Yeah.
Who should impeach the president? Should it be Supreme Court or the Congress? Oh, let's make it Congress. How many people should be in the presidency? 1, 2, 3? And they said, now 3 didn't work for the Romans, let's go with 1. We can change these things.
Yeah.
We could have Supreme Court for 14 or 18 years. Maybe the biggest state should have 3 senators, and the smallest state should have 1.
Yeah, it boggles me that North and South Dakota have 4 senators, where the population doesn't total that of Brooklyn, which has 2 as a whole state. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically Wyoming is 1/20th the size of California.
Yeah.
Yet they both have senators. Right. And this is something that I think should be remembered.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks would like that. Anyway, so I'm going to bring this back to you a little bit. You are a reporter. You, have reported from war zones, and written about them in book form as well as reporting. So, what lessons in resilience have you seen that have relevance for us right now?
What I've seen in war zones is that resilience is incredibly important. Self-care is incredibly important. And sleep is so important. The second thing I've learned is that you can be very surprised by who's resilient and who's not. It's not necessarily the big macho guy who succeeds most. It might be that small, careful, quiet guy. Third thing I've learned, war is the opposite. War is a state of ungrace, not quite disgrace. But some societies have had ceremonies in which one re-enters the society after war and becomes civilized again, because it's so fundamentally different from being a human being fighting in a war. I've seen some very good generals. What I've learned about generals is that good generals learn, they adjust, they change, they reflect daily. This is one reason I'm so impressed about Washington, because it did learn and reflect.
Right. Yeah, and I was going to ask you, the question arose because you have served in combat zones, written in them. What lens do you view Washington through? Because he's the only one of the founders who was actually a combat veteran, as we would say in our time. So.
I look at it through the lens of war and with an understanding of war and of leadership of war, which I think my take on Washington is very different from the typical American academic historian. One thing, academics are very good at words, and that makes Washington additionally difficult because he's not a man of words, he's a man of deeds. And I don't think academics really understand Washington's deeds.
Right. And speaking of, I'll pick up from Jim Madison when he's talking about you, said that unlike academic historians, you actually go, at the end of the book, you talk about things we should be considering. So was it 8 points or something?
I think it was 10. It kept on changing.
10. And it was one that's drunk up. Redefine what it means to be, quote, un-American. So.
One of the great things about this country is that somebody who became a citizen yesterday has every bit as many rights as somebody whose family has been here for hundreds of years. And that's because we have a strategic document, the U.S. Constitution, that tells us who we are, how we work, how we're supposed to operate. So a congressman who slugs a reporter is acting in an un-American way. Likewise, a college student who wants to stop somebody from speaking on their campus just because they disagree with them is acting in an un-American way. And it's actually Jefferson, for all my problems, who lays this out very neatly in his first inaugural address. He says 2 points, and this is in response to the advocates after his presidency. He said, number one, because somebody disagrees with you doesn't mean they're bad or good. Number two, I'm not going to throw critical newspaper editors into jail. I'm going to rely on the court of public opinion. If I'm right, public opinion. If I'm wrong, Congress, people will go to the other.
You know, it's interesting you're talking about the political or censorial press. I was stunned, and you've talked about this and written about it. Adams actually threw his print critics or publishing critics in jail for.
Yeah, when people talk about social media being so disruptive these days, my response is look at the 1790s. Newspapers, political newspapers were emerging first time. You'd had kind of shipping news newspapers, but that was different. Newspapers as political entities are coming up in the 1790s. It's driving John Adams nuts. He thinks it's treasonous to criticize the president. He's terrified of faction because his hero Cicero said faction destroyed the republic. So he thinks he's defending the country by throwing people in jail. So, you know, I don't think we need to throw Twitter or Facebook into jail. Things we've had disruptive times before.
Right.
And have a very resilient constitution.
Yeah. And your point in here is of your 10 points, one of is know your history. And that's so important for our time. Tom, as we're coming to the end of our chat today, and as I ask all of our guests, can you share a story of grace with us, please? So,
I can. I felt grace in a couple of different ways. For me, especially coming out of wars, I was pretty beat up coming out of the Iraq War. It was a terrible war. I expected the American military to act so poorly and sometimes so badly. And it really gave me something. And I remember the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I went for a long sea kayak paddle. And I wound up in an odd spot because there's a tidal river that runs in different directions from the tide. And I was waiting for the tide to change. It took forever, so I sat on a rock, and eventually the direction of the river changed. And I got back in my kayak and went home, and I said, that's over. And I felt like I had achieved some kind of grace to nature, but I'd lost it.
What a beautiful story. That's rich. Tom, you have been a great guest today. As I've said, I'm a great fan of your work. You have taught me much. I've quoted your work, and it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you on. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's been terrific. Anytime.
Great.